Welcome to the Calm Cockpit, where pilots of all levels can find high-performance tools, actionable strategies, and access to professionals who can help you fly smarter and stress less.
Today, we're talking to Captain Daniel Galvin, corporate pilot and representative on the National Business Aviation Association's Security Council. We'll be discussing a topic that affects every pilot, whether you're flying a corporate jet or a Cessna 172, and that's the intersection of aviation safety, security, and pilot well-being.
When most of us think about security, we picture fences, gates, or the post-9/11 restrictions that have reshaped how we fly. But really, security is much more than that. It's an invisible framework that supports everything we do in aviation.
Exactly, and the National Business Aviation Association, or the NBAA, plays a big role here. Their Security Council was first formed after 9/11 with a heavy focus on counterterrorism and keeping airspace and aviation safe.
Today's episode isn't just about security, though. It's about this foundation of aviation safety, the well-being of aviators, and the choices we make that keep us flying smart and flying safe.
The Calm Cockpit Podcast starts now.
Onyx 12 Mike Oscar, runway 27, clear for takeoff.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. I'm Geeta Brown, midlife student pilot and licensed yoga and meditation educator with over 30 years of experience teaching high performers how to improve their lives without adding stress.
And I'm John Niehaus, professional pilot and flight instructor.
I learned so much in this upcoming interview you guys are going to hear with Daniel Galvin, and so I hope you listeners all feel the same. As always with our interviews, John and I are going to chat just for a little bit, just to kind of give you the framework. Then you'll hear the bulk of the interview with Daniel. And then on the opposite end, we're going to meet back and give you some actionable takeaways that you can start putting into action right now. So this episode was a little bit of maybe like a humble pie moment for me, because as a wellness educator, as a musician, I sort of realized that I take security for granted. And at first I was thinking, what role does security have in creating a calm cockpit? Sort of felt like it was like a little tangential from our mission on this podcast. And then as he talked and I listened and I started thinking about it, I realized that it's really safety security is this quiet net in the background. When security is working, you don't notice it. But if it's missing, we really notice it.
And that's where the NBAA comes in. Daniel's an active member of their Aviation Security Council, where he contributes his expertise to shaping best practices and enhancing security protocols across the aviation industry. Their Security Council started back in right around 9/11 times, and back then it was more about counterterrorism and airspace restrictions and regulations.
But as we'll hear Daniel talk about in the interview, the threats really have changed. They're doing a lot of work with cybersecurity, drones, GPS spoofing, and even things like if your airplane is secure when it's sitting in a hangar for maintenance. But here's what I found really interesting about this interview, that security isn't locks and passwords and gates. It also comes down to how secure we feel as pilots. Because if I'm up in the cockpit second guessing whether something in the aircraft is safe, my focus is already divided.
And a divided focus equals reduced safety, which is why the NBAA also gets involved in pilot mental health. They've even checked and backed regulation to make mental health care more accessible for aviators. And if you think that this episode is just about large airplanes and jets, all of this trickles down regardless of what you fly.
Absolutely. That was some of my big aha moments, which you'll hear me exclaim during the interview with Dan, where I really saw how woven this is into our entire ecosystem of aviation. So let me give you a little background on Dan himself before you hear him speak. So he's a very skilled and forward-thinking aviation professional. He has about 25 years of comprehensive experience in both domestic and international flight operations, safety management, and aviation security. So he's a senior captain at MP Air. He operates a global 6,000 and 7,500, or you call it the 7,500 probably, aircraft in both domestic and worldwide operations under our United States Part 91 operations. In addition additions to flying airplanes, though, he also manages and maintains critical security programs such as the DCA access and gateway programs, and he supports operational efficiency through strategic planning and process improvement. He also does work on safety. He has a role as a safety and flight standards captain, which means that he ensures that all aspects of his department's safety program align with industry best practices. He does liaison work with safety organization. He investigates incidents, and he updates those operational manuals that we all know and love to address emerging risks and regulatory changes. I mean, he has his fingers in the pie of this in a deep way, and I think it comes through in the interview. As we said, we're going to do at the top part of the interview, you'll hear him talk a little bit about his work as, I believe, a volunteer on the NBAA Security Council. And I think it's fascinating how they're really working to build things at a very ground level right now. And we're very lucky that he came on the show to talk with us. He also flew formerly for Celestial Airways Limited, was based in Dubai, and also for E-Trade Financial Corporations. So you can see he's got this real wealth of information about security, not only on a domestic level, but also internationally. And you'll hear him speak towards like the second half of the interview, really at a deep personal level of how this has gone into his standard operating procedures, how he manages challenging situations, how he handles his own mindset. So there's a really full interview here with just a ton of fantastic information. And I do want to clarify, you'll hear at times where he's really speaking and giving reflection on the NBAA. And there's times when he puts on his own personal hat and gives his own personal opinion. I think those will be very obvious in the interview, but we just want to make it clear that there's times where he's speaking sort of as his role with that organization. And there's a lot of personal reflection as well. So I think you'll get a lot of really fantastic information from this interview.
Well, without further ado, here's the interview with Daniel. Captain Daniel Galvin, welcome to the Calm Cockpit.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Today's kind of a special episode for our listeners. I mean, this is kind of something where we get to show how the cheese is made, how security in aviation not just is maintained, but kind of where a lot of it comes from and how that sort of bleeds into general aviation and into even sort of the small private airplanes that people can rent and fly, and how all of this comes together. Dan, when we first started talking about this, you brought up the fact that there is an association out there called NBAA that sort of helps maintain this. As we mentioned in your bio, you volunteer for the NBAA, or National Business Aviation Association Security Council. Can you first give our listeners just a little bit of a insight into what is NBAA? What does it do and what's it for?
Well, sure. Glad to. So the NBAA has been around for a long time, decades and decades. And what it does is it is the advocacy and the voice for the general aviation and corporate aviation part of the world, right? So it spans anything from your single, small owner-operator flight department all the way up to the largest flight departments, charter operators, people like FlexJet, ExecJet, stuff like that. So it is a group mainly of volunteers. You know, there are paid staff that are at the office in Washington, but most of it are people like myself who have a day job, and we volunteer to be on different committees and help out, either put on presentations or host events or work on committees such as the security committee. And what it does is, being an advocacy group, is that they know who to talk to in DC to get voices heard or weigh in on certain things with either, say, the FAA or the federal government for funding or whatever. It's part of what they do. So, like you said, I sit on the Security Council for the NBAA.
And it's interesting because for anybody who's listening to this going, man, you guys are sort of championing some of the smaller pilot operations, people who fly Cessnas and Pipers and things like that. Why would NBAA affect me? And I'll let you chime in with your opinion, but my initial thoughts for all of that, I mean, just like the Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, or NBAA, or NAFI, any of these associations, they have the resources to affect aviation as a whole. So even if you're not a business aviator or a flight instructor or an airline pilot, the regulatory effect that they have sort of bleeds down to all aspects, regardless of whether you're following that sort of career path or not, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, let's take a simple example. DCA, right? Just go look at a sectional for the Washington, D.C. area, and you're going to see prohibited airspaces. You're going to see, DCA itself, right? There's certain airports around the DCA airport area that are not easy to get in and out of, and it's for a reason. To get into Reagan itself as a Part 91 operator, you have to have a fully vetted, fully established security program. So yes, it does absolutely affect everybody, because you can go for a Sunday afternoon flight up the Potomac to a certain distance, and then you're gonna have two nice people in F-16s, one on either side of you, escorting you home. And the other way it plays in, even beyond DC, where this is a big country, right? Most people that probably hear this don't ever fly near Reagan or even the East Coast, but TFR surrounding sporting events or race car races or national power generation, like nuclear plants and stuff like that. Those are all restricted airspace. And part of what the NBAA does and especially the Security Council, is advocate for your access to things like that, right? Or to those areas. Say you want to go to the Super Bowl in your private airplane, you can do it, but there's a process for it, and it comes from down from above. TSA, FAA will push it down, and then people like the NBAA can go, okay, we get it, but here's how this will affect this group of operators or this group of operators. So it's kind of one of those things. It's like more perspectives make a better picture, right? Because I'm not going to know everything, you're not going to know everything, but together we can go, oh right, that's your blind spot, that's my blind spot, and hopefully we can work something out to make it better access for everyone.
Yeah, and people forget that if you go to your local airport and rent an airplane, guess what? It's a private airplane. It doesn't have to be a jet,
Right.
that has multiple seats and flies halfway across the country. It can be a Cessna 172 that you and your friend rent for the day to go get $100 hamburger. It affects us all.
Well, it absolutely, it absolutely affects us all. But the other thing is like, I'm of a certain age now, right? I remember when all the ramps at the FBOs were covered with King Airs and Hawkers, and if you saw a Gulfstream 4, you're like, that thing is huge, and you'll see like 2 of them a year or 2 of them a month, depending where you are. The evolution over the last decade or two, the airplanes have gotten bigger. So where I'm going with this is, like, when I graduated college in the 90s, one of my friend's first corporate flying jobs was actually in a PA-28 Archer. So there are companies to this day that still do that sort of stuff, that fly those sort of airplanes. So the person sitting next to you in your T hangar with an Archer or an Arrow or a Saratoga, yeah, it might be privately owned, but it might also be for corporations. So these sort of things affect them as well, right? It's not just those of us that are sitting 45,000 feet doing Mach 8.5.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's serendipitous, because I think a huge part of what we do and how pilots are trained and especially bringing new people in, a lot of it revolves around safety and security and how that feels and how that's affected, and maybe even sometimes the hoops you have to jump through. And a few weeks ago, I was actually honored to be a part of the Love Fly podcast. And one of the things that they brought up in that podcast was just the feeling from the passenger side of how they feel safe, and knowing what kinds of things are in place from a regulatory standpoint or a training standpoint of, if the pilots are safe, then the passengers are safe. And so I think what people will get out of this episode, more than anything else, is just understanding how all that comes together, why it's there, and what even civilian operators are doing to affect sort of how the future of that looks.
Absolutely. Like you said, if the passengers know what you go through as a crew member, their peace of mind is worth a lot, right? So if they know, hey, all of our people have been through this training, or all of our people have been through that training. It's like you and I were talking before we hit record, was like, you asked me, hey, what have you been up to? I said, well, I was in cabin recurrent a couple of weeks ago. And you're like, really? I'm like, yeah, our department, all of us, flight attendants, mechanics, EP, pilots, we all go through cabin training. Well, why? Well, partially because it includes important things, but also for the peace of mind in the fact that our bosses go, right, if our flight attendant goes down with something, the rest of my crew can do this, do their job in a pinch. So yeah, those sort of things, they can be inconvenient conversations to begin with. You're like, hey, boss, we need to go do some more training. But overall, my experience has been that after you get past that conversation, everybody's like, yeah, this was a good decision.
So before we dig into the nitty gritty, I guess the other sort of informational question for you is, okay, we know what NBAA is. We know that you volunteer for this security council without saying anything you're not supposed to. Let's talk about this. Where did it come from? What does it do? And what can our listeners learn from this?
Sure. So the Security Council was created in the aftermath of 9/11. There was a lot of things in our world that changed that day, and aircraft security was one of them. Originally, this council was established as mainly a law enforcement style. Hey, we're worried about terrorism. We're worried about hijackings. We're worried about that sort of aspects, right? Access to Reagan. Because after 9/11, Ronald Reagan Airport was shut down for months to access to anyone who wasn't an airline. So the NBAA got together and said, hey, we've got people that got different sets of skills. Let's put a council together, see if there's anybody interested in kind of taking on this role. Because we as operators and we as the flying public have kind of some rights to what we can access or what we can't access. And the council was established to do those things and have those conversations with people like TSA, with DHS, with the FAA, take your long list of three-letter agencies, and there's probably been a conversation with the majority, if not all. So for the longest time, the Security Council was focused on access to Reagan, the 12-5 program, charter programs, right? All the security aspects of vetting crew members, stuff like that. Access to TFRs, and then ran with that role till roughly about the time COVID hit, right? And so we as the council kind of went dark, not because we wanted to, but because the resources weren't there. And then coming out of COVID, the NBA reached out to all of the former members and said, hey, it's time. We want to fire this thing back up and get going again. So what we do now is we do still have those conversations. We still do advocate for access for operators, but we've kind of expanded because when the council was established, no one knew what a drone was. Mm-hmm. Now we're sharing airspace with them on a daily basis. It's going to grow exponentially over the next decade. We're going to have to interface with them on some level. Things like jamming and spoofing, that's new too. Well, how do we deal with that? And we if you put my NBAA hat on, we as the NBAA or we as the Security Council owe it to our operators because a lot of our operators go all over the world. So they need to be informed on what's out there, what's happening, who to talk to when something happens, how to pass the information back to us so we can speak better for them. But the other thing is it's not only those of us that are going out of the country, that information needs to be spread here across the United States because it hasn't happened for the most part here yet. Doesn't mean it won't. So trying to be reactive in a lot of ways, we're trying to be a little more proactive. Another thing that we've really expanded into is cybersecurity. That can be anything from a small airplane all the way up to a largest Gulfstream or global. So cybersecurity issues are huge, right? It's stuff like that we've kind of grown into. One of the things that we did, we looked at is we need more expertise in cybersecurity. We need more expertise in maintenance because, you take your airplane and park it in the hangar at a maintenance facility for 6 weeks. Who's watching it? Who has access to it? What can happen? And it was just one of those conversations we were having. We're like, I think we just found a blind spot. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot going on, but that's kind of the focus at the moment.
It's interesting, and I'm not sure if this applies or not, but one of the big sort of conversation points over the last, call it 10 years or so, especially on the GA side. And when I say GA, I mean light piston airplanes. Yeah. A lot of the associations were talking about how the security at airports, even at some of the smaller ones, were increased post 9/11. And one of the negatives to that, especially for somebody who's coming into aviation or has a desire to come into aviation, is that's just not a very welcoming environment. You walk up to your small local airport and there's barbed wire, there's fences, or whatever that looks like, and it's a very stay out, go away standpoint. But you've got a flight instructor on the other side of the fence going, "Please come in. I need you. Come here."
Yeah. I need to pay my light bill.
Right. So, does the council deal with that kind of airport security type things too? And how does the yin and yang to stay away, but also, hey, we're really nice and friendly and you should come in and talk to us? Like, how does that play out in your world?
Yeah, it's a really good point because I'm like you. I remember prior to 9/11, like you could just roll up to the hangar or to an airport and go watch airplanes all day, even at a small airport, right? And it just doesn't do that, or you can't do that anymore. Not to the same level, anyway. It is something that we talk about. It is a line that we walk because both sides have very valid points and very valid needs. I think that the way to approach it, at least for us at the moment, is more along the lines of outreach. It's more on us to go outside of the wire for them to come inside the wire, so to speak. Because that's where the conversation is going to start. The conversation started at a coffee shop, right? Hey, if you're interested, why don't you come with me? We'll go do it. It's showing the leadership. It's taking the charge of it. I know. I miss those days of just being able to walk up and go knock on the door. In fact, I was recently had that experience here, and it's interesting that you bring that up because I was on my way driving back home from a couple of errands, and there's a small little airport, 15, 20 minutes from my house, and I was like, I'm going to drive by there and just go see where to take to get checked out, or so I could take my kids for a ride or my wife for a ride or whatever, right? So I rolled by there, and this little airport in the middle of nowhere had 8-foot tall barbed wire fence and a gate. I'm like, I don't even know if the place is paved. Like, it turns out it was, but it was just kind of like that little bit of a rural airport. I'm like, here I am, 30 years of experience in this industry with all the type ratings, been all over the place, and I feel intimidated by that.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally get what you're saying, and I'm on the same page as you. But I think the difference is we kind of have to go to them at this point versus them coming to us, so to speak.
It's so interesting to me as a midlife student pilot coming to this, I had a fear of flying. That's why I got into this whole game, right? To overcome that. So, walking up to an airport to me, with a big high gate and the code to enter was very intimidating. Luckily, my school does have its offices in the airport proper, like by the restaurant. So very public access. You can get into the pilot's lounge and all of that. You just can't get on the ramp. But what I'm hearing you what I'm hearing you saying, it's giving me, as a relative newbie compared to you guys, a different perspective on security. If I'm looking at it, thinking of the calm cockpit, like the holistic health and performance of an aviator, I'm seeing security in a new light as this like invisible support that wraps around and is infused in absolutely everything that we do. And I think that a lot of pilots perhaps don't think about it as much because it is such an invisible support. Like our holistic health, our ability to do our job as aviators, or if you're an aviation business owner, we need security as architecture and a foundation before we can even enjoy the access to these places. And if we don't have that sense of security, flying under, duress or fear or a niggling question in your mind of is someone gaining access to my airplane that's not a trustworthy person, that erodes safety. But I feel like it's this invisible thing that you've been highlighting to me anyway, that is just there that perhaps we take for granted as part of our health of the overall aviation system. So I think there's room for some conversations there between the work that your security council is doing and all of the pilots to highlight it and just make people aware of it. And then that can lead to some of the conversations you're saying. And maybe then that leads to other councils who then can provide a voice for it when it goes to legislation, so that it's not this invisible thing, but that it's really understood and then advocated for. So I'm just reflecting what I'm learning as I'm listening, but it's really
I
important work.
think you're absolutely right on it. And it kind of ties in, like you said, the holistic aspect of it is like, if you're worried or concerned about something, you're not going to be able to focus. That
Right.
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're learning to fly or you're
Right.
actually flying or you're
Right.
teaching someone to fly or pumping gas on the ramp, right?
Right.
If you're having that little voice in your head, it's like I taught my daughters when they're growing up. I'm like, if that little voice is there, you
Yep.
need to listen to it.
Yep.
And we're evolving, I think, in a lot of ways in the industry. It's like when I got started, the community was different. When you were at a small airport, there were 40 airplanes on the whole airport. You knew who owned them. You knew what they were doing. It's like a small community neighborhood, right, that you live in. But whereas like what we do with the Security Council, it has to span the little airport in Iowa that I learned to fly at, all the way up to include Teterboro, Peachtree, Van Nuys, pick one, right? Westchester, Fort Lauderdale, because you've got such a gamut in those airports where Part 91 and Part 135 operators go. So it's a hard gate to get through sometimes because it's got to fit everybody to some degree.
Well, and our country is huge, and yeah, it makes sense. Our country is so huge and diverse in, topography and even, demographics. You guys I don't envy your job as a security counsel. You're smart to take it slow and get the foundation right. I think this is a good time for our audience to have access to understand that this is a resource for them, that we can have some of the conversations that maybe as you guys get your foundation, that there's some fruitful conversations that can come out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like you said, like we've been saying, it applies to everybody, directly or indirectly.
And the interesting part is that, yes, it applies, but to Geeta's point, it applies to things that are so operationally different. All of that stuff has to integrate. And if one airplane's not secure, then the entire system's not secure. And so that's really kind of the astounding piece to, if you zoom out into the entire sort of aviation web or network, all the pieces have to be right. Every piece has its own established level of security and cohesiveness with the entire field. As we kind of continue this discussion, I think one of the things that we talk about regularly on the show is kind of that sort of human factor side to everything. Like, how does the individual play into this? And even in our pre-interview talks, the couple that really kind of came to mind that I think a lot of people are aware of are some of the sort of mental health tragedies that have happened over the years. Things like the Germanwings accident, and we're not going to get into the gory details of what happened, but that certainly was a huge red flag in terms of mental health and the stress that pilots operate under regularly through, again, all complexities of the field. Then you also have things like that Alaska ramp worker who wasn't even a pilot and started doing barrel rolls over the Puget Sound. These are all things where I'm not saying that the human is the weak link in here, but I think what we are saying is that a massive part of aviation security revolves around the individual. And so what exactly does the Security Council kind of talk about when it comes to sort of managing or understanding kind of the human element to this?
Well, I think the two things that rise to the top on that part of the subject, one, the NBAA as a whole has come out just in the last, especially in the last week with this mental health authorization bill. Mm-hmm. They came out and made a really strong statement how they support this and the moving forward of mental health treatment for all involved, not just the pilots. But I guess the other thing that sticks to my head is you mentioned Germanwings, is that one of the, and like you, I don't really want to go into the details of it, but one of the things that stuck with that is, hey, how come this guy hadn't been noticed sooner? How come it got to where it got? Well, because the nationality that he is, it was very focused on personal privacy, meaning the country, your rights to privacy were extremely strong in that country. So he was under no obligation to really bring that out. So what does that mean for what we do? Well, it ties in because we're trying to open conversations, kind of like what came out this week in the statement for the NBAA. It's like, look, this is important stuff. We need to start being more open about this. We need to start handing access to people that feel like they have nowhere else to go, because that in itself will create security. We don't need to over legislate. You have to balance personal privacy versus need to know, right? It is a line to walk, and we have those conversations, absolutely. But it is definitely an issue, and we all know it, and it is something that I see permeating all of what we do in aviation going forward. It seems like now things are just getting going.
You mentioned NBAA's official stance.
The National Business Aircraft Aviation Association welcomed passage by the U.S. House of Representatives a bipartisan bill to improve pilot access to mental health care. We are encouraged to see the continued progress on this important legislation combating the stigma and misinformation surrounding mental health concerns among our nation's pilot community, said NBAA President and CEO Ed Boland. It is vital that we foster an environment where pilots can seek help without fear of professional repercussions, while also enhancing the safety of the traveling public.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it is definitely a step in the right direction, and it is an example, like we said in the beginning, of sort of that high level legislation of we're not just talking about airline pilots. We're not just talking about corporate or charter pilots. We're giving access to anyone with a pilot medical to be able to operate within whatever realm this decision-making process settles on. And I think that it's important for everybody to understand that, because as Geeta mentioned in a previous episode, I think it was with Dr. Adler-Neal, where Geeta, you had a family member pass away and you were weighing the decision of like, well, I feel like I need to talk to somebody. Who should I talk to? And that's a decision that no matter what level of pilot, student pilots, ATP, we're all the same in that. And
right. And I was just going to bring that up. I'm glad you said that. It's like, you want to talk about a uniting factor, right? Geeta, as a student pilot, you're sitting here with two guys who've been around the block once or twice. The three of us are all in the same boat when it comes to that topic. We're at the same level. One thing I was thinking about this morning before the phone call was I recently did a program called Mental Health First Aid. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
So there's another group that I'm a part of. It's the Northeast Safety Roundtable. It's a large group of corporate operators, basically from where I live east and from Richmond, Virginia north. What they do is they get together and we share. Our safety officers all meet a couple times a year. And one of our meetings, we did a mental health first aid training. A bunch of us, I think there's 24 of us or something in the class that day, are all now certified mental health first aid responders. So I think it's things like that are starting to seep into our industry that are going to be some great tools. And there's a couple guys that I've seen speak. One of them is a BA captain. I can't think of his name right at the moment, but he does a peer support group, which those sorts of things exist within the airline unions, internal to themselves, but we don't have access to that. So this guy started this peer mentor group, and according to him, 80% of the time people feel relief from just speaking to a peer mentor.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yep.
And so like those two things like that, if they worked hand in hand, that would take care of an awful lot. So yeah, This is absolutely necessary.
I am so intrigued by this mental health first aid training, and I think John and I are probably going to be looking that up and perhaps a future episode. This is, wow. How cool is that? This all reminds me so much of what you were saying when we first started talking about shifting from this reactive stance to being a proactive stance with safety. And it's the same thing with mental health. I feel like the conversation is shifting from, oh, you have a mental health challenge. That means you have a mental health issue. Oh, you go in this bucket over here, to no, we are all human. Guess what? We all have mental health issues. And it exists along a spectrum where a lot of low-cost, free, very simple interventions can make a profound difference. And I think that's a really great place for the conversation to shift. And I hope that as all this grassroots stuff is starting, that also eventually makes its way towards the legislation, which is more sticky and tricky because it covers so much. And it's hard to, as you said, balance that personal privacy versus the need to know versus when does a diagnosis tip into being something that is truly detrimental to your ability to do your job. But I love this idea of shifting from being reactive to proactive and also normalizing the fact that mental health is not something that you either have or you don't have. It's a spectrum that you should always be working on, just like you work on your physical health and your relationships. It's like part of our responsibility as a pilot. So I think this is all great stuff you're bringing to light here.
Well, and I think that again, this is me speaking personally, but one of my other jobs is our company safety officer. And if you look at the history of safety management and safety programs, it started out as a reactive, hey, how do we fix this? But as it's grown over the decades, it not only has it gone from being reactive, but now it's trying to be proactive or predictive. Now, I wouldn't say that anyone's trying to predict someone's future mental health, but it is an evolution, right? Currently, we're at where safety programs were a few decades ago. We're reactive with a mental health aspect of it. But if we keep kind of going where we seem to be going, at some point, I think, I wouldn't say, like I said, I don't want to say predictive, but proactive, I think would be a better term for it, is that it's just a matter of evolution time.
It is interesting to me to see how things have changed. I mean, if you had been 10, 15 years ago and you said, hey, there's a mental health first aid course to a bunch of pilots, they all would have looked at you like you were from a different planet. And, it's just an interesting cultural shift. It's an interesting sort of professional shift. And, I do believe that it is a step in the right direction. And some of the things that you're talking about in terms of mentors and some of the other things you mentioned, not to pat ourselves on the back, Gita, but I am reaffirmed that a lot of the topics that we are covering here on this podcast are critical, or at least time sensitive in terms of what's being talked about right now and how it can legitimately help people. We do try to make sure that we provide some, not just a conversation, but tools and techniques and tips for somebody to have an actionable step of, what am I going to do? I feel this way, or I'm working on this. I want to be better. How do we improve that? And I think that that's where something like what we're doing can really align with something like the Security Council or some of the other roundtable discussions. I know my company is part of the Midwest Safety Roundtable. I'm not the safety officer for my company, but I know we participate in it. And I also know that, again, when it comes to security issues in flight, I mean, we were talking earlier about collision advisory issues and traffic awareness and things like that. I mean, that does not just apply to us. And when it happens to a larger airplane or a larger operator, it just brings to light something, because we have a larger platform and a louder mic than somebody who's in a 172 or a Piper who's had the exact same thing happen to them, but they've had nowhere to go with it. I mean, yes, you can fill out a NASA form. Thank you, JJ. But you never quite know exactly what kind of effect filling out a NASA form is going to have. It just kind of, again, continues to reiterate that fact that what happens to some of the larger operators happens to all of us, just at a different platform.
I appreciate the humility of, don't want to pat yourself on the back, but the reality of it is you should be proud of it. You should be proud of the work that you're doing, because it's important work. And if it's not for somebody like you guys that are trying to get this out here, someone's not going to hear it. So I think you guys are dead on where you need to be. And, I just had a thought about the peace of mind aspect that we had earlier. I used to fly for an individual who would only hire pilots that were married with kids. And one time, I don't know if it was myself, I think it was somebody else in our department asked him, I said, why will you only hire pilots that are married with kids here? And his response was really straightforward. He goes, it's peace of mind, because I know you'd have a reason to go home.
Interesting.
Wow.
So that really that's a real practical tie into the whole peace of mind conversation we had earlier. And that, when I was standing 3 feet away from him, 4 feet away from him when he said that, I'm like, whoa, I just got hit across the head with a 2x4. Like it was that impactful, because I never thought of that way.
Wow.
And, the people that we tend to fly, John and I tend to fly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the airplane is an extension of their home or their office.
Mm-hmm.
2 places they feel extremely safe. And working for publicly traded companies or high net worth individuals, there are very few people that can tell them no and survive their job.
And stick around, yeah.
And stick around. But I get paid, that's what I get paid to do. I don't fly for money. I get paid to make decisions, and I get paid to make good decisions. And if you're not where you need to be, then that gets to be an issue. And these people are, especially at the levels that we operate at, these people are extremely good at reading situations, reading the room, and reading individuals, because that's how they got where they got to. So you may be able to tell yourself that I'm okay. Doesn't mean that somebody else is going to believe it.
That's like the heart of human factors right there.
Right?
I'm like speechless, but not speechless.
So as we start looking at sort of the individual security, and this is more, I guess, for you and all of us to just kind of discuss less about the Security Council, but to your point of trying to figure out if you're okay, and somebody may be standing in front of you putting any kind of pressure, or maybe they don't intend to, they're just there by their presence. Sometimes there's pressure. What kinds of things do you personally do as a professional aviator in your position to sort of mitigate? Am I fit to fly? Am I going to a place where I'm anxious because it's dangerous, or I'm anxious just because I don't really want to do it? Like where does your brain go in those types of scenarios?
So I operate personally out of a mental model that I hope somebody else created, because I do not want to take credit for this. So I was thinking one day, I was like, people often talk about, are you going to give 100% or 110%, or, because it's a graph like this, right? It's like a bar graph. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, if anybody tells me they're going to give 110%, that tells me 2 things about that person. one, they don't know what they're capable of, or two, they're sandbagged for whatever reason. So that got me thinking, I'm like, well, what do I really need? Because people use those terms all the time, right? And they don't mean them ill by using that term. And I was thinking about, like, to me, I'm like, I operate more in a circle. So if you were to draw a circle and place yourself in the middle of it, and then around the circle, I place things that matter. My family, my physical health, my mental health, my work, all, those things kind of go around like a clock face. And I try personally to operate at 80 to 85% all the time. And the reason I choose 80 to 85% is it gives me the ability to surge in a certain direction and still stay within 100% ability. So if one of my kids is sick or there's something wrong at home or whatever, I have to spend more time and mental energy on my family vector, which means I have to pull a little bit less out of maybe working out or a little bit less out of work and go to my boss and say, boss, I need to back off just a little bit because I got this going on, or things like that. That's how I approach my role as a person, holistic. To me, that's more holistic because you can't exceed 100%, right? The only way an airplane can exceed 100% is an afterburner, right? And I don't have that. So I'm limited to 100%. By having these little vectors in my head, they're constantly moving. Some are growing, some are shrinking. It takes time, and sometimes I still screw it up, but it takes time to figure that out. And so professionally and personally, that's how I operate. Does that long way around answer your question?
I actually really like that, and I would add one thing to your analogy, and I would say the one way to exceed 100% in the airplane is to go past that red line, and there's catastrophic failures to doing so. And so personally, if you were to exceed that 100% that you're capable of, that's when failure exists, whether that's failure on the mental capacity standpoint, from the fatigue standpoint, just ability to handle or deal with things standpoint. So that would be the only thing I would add, but it's apropos to it because what happens most often when somebody has sort of that moment in their lives when they just can't handle it anymore. Well, you've been exceeding your capacity for however long your body just decided, I'm done. And you can't do that. So knowing your limits and knowing where that 100% is, I think is extremely important. And so I think what you just said, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You can sprint for a short period of time, but you can run at pace. At least I can for way longer because your heart's not in the red. And sometimes people see it, and sometimes it's just internal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Neither is wrong. Both are necessary, really.
Dan, what I love about your model too, and the way you explained it, not only that it's a circle and it's holistic, but that you said sometimes I will take from one vector so that I can push it into another vector. And I think most high achievers, we feel like we should be operating on all the vectors at 100% all the time. And particularly women, we really fall in that category. We do know that women, once we have children, even if we're in a two-parent household, that women still do the preponderance of the child care. Present company might be excluded, but we do know we have a lot of data to show that women are doing a lot more of the child care in that work too. So we have this I have to have it all syndrome with women, right? She can have it all. But then we end up burned out, and then we go into menopause, burned out, and then we have all these adverse health outcomes. So I love this idea that it is a sliding scale and that you take from one category so that you can give to another, and that is how the system is designed to function, because that is how our body and our brain functions. Our body only has so much energy per day to expend, right? Basal metabolic rate. You can't outrun that. So by constantly shifting and appropriating your resources appropriately, you're working with your biology and working in a way that is going to be sustainable. So I just wanted to also give a shout to how that functions biologically, but also for women in particular to understand you don't have to do it and have it all the time. You should be shifting within this framework. I would love to make a little graphic of this. I'm going to try to I'm going to have to credit you with it, like Dan's circle of holistic awesomeness. I don't know what we're going to call it, but it's a really cool, I love this idea that it's in flux and it's in flow, and that any day you could make your own vectors and decide what your vectors are going to be and where you might be applying more energy or less. I think it's a really useful model, particularly for people who are like starting out in an airline career and don't have the ability like we do in our wiser years to have more agency at our jobs, to advocate for ourselves and what we need when we're younger. Sometimes we just have to grind it out. So I think it'd be really useful for them.
I completely agree with that. In some cases, you do need to grind it out.
Yeah.
But that's why when I said sometimes
temporarily though,
sometimes you don't. Right? Sometimes I know that there's an expectation that's up here that I have to handle, and it is a grind. So that means I need to mentally say, all right, well, that means less doing this or less doing that for now because of the larger picture.
Yeah.
And, I agree that we've all been sold the bill of goods of you can have it all. I don't know that I believe that anymore.
Yeah. I believed it when I was younger, but now that I'm 50, I'm like, nope.
Yeah. I've watched people through my career that are ahead of you, and you're like, I want to get there. I want to be like that, which is good. It's good to have goals. I've got all sorts of goals. But at the same time, and it took a long time for me to see it, but I'm like, these people that were this far ahead of me that I could never quite catch up to, work may be all they had.
Yep.
They didn't have a spouse. They didn't have kids. They didn't take care of their health. I've seen it all.
Right.
And it's like, oh, I'm growing like this, circular out. They're growing straight up, like a tower, a tree. Probably shouldn't say weed; that would be detrimental. But that's not the point. But yeah, so
it's funny the other analogy to what you just said that hits home for me, and I used to use this in different ways as a flight instructor, but as a self-proclaimed video game nerd, when you're playing a game where you have to build a character and they give you 7 skill points, and each of those skill points can be spread out however you want across 5 characteristics. Some people go, oh, I want my guy to be strong, and they go all 7 in strong. Well, guess what? Your character in the game, not very smart, not very fast.
Nope. Can't move.
Not very agile. Super strong, but he's there to, take a beating. And
like bull. Yeah.
But if you spread them out, obviously now there's sort of that you may not be as strong as you otherwise would be, but you have all of these other attributes. And so like that's where my brain goes. It's like, if I'm building a character, like how would I want to be in real life? So that's
that's a perfect comparison, because if I remember correctly, that's where I got it from. I was playing Mario Kart or something with my daughter. I'm like, oh, duh. Some PhD must have figured this out.
Right?
I know I didn't.
As we start to kind of wind this down, one of the other things I heard you say that I'd like to kind of pinpoint, we've referenced it a couple times in different topics, but just the notion of having to have the ability and the capability for decision making to say no. And what does that look like? And how does that affect the mission, if there is one? Whether you're standing in front of a very high-powered executive or wealthy individual, or trying to kind of decide, am I taking this private pilot check ride today? I've got this examiner standing in front of me asking me, are we going or not? And the pilot brain, the individual who tends to go in these directions, wants to figure out a way to complete the mission. And it's not always a black and white. I mean, certainly if it's a check ride, a lot of times it's a yes or a no. Are we going? Maybe not today. But then, of course, you say no to the check ride, the skies turn blue, and you go, boy, I really wish I had. In our world, it's not always a yes or no. It's a, well, we shouldn't do this, but maybe we can get close. I can't get you into West Palm. Maybe I can get you into Lauderdale or wherever. What does that look like in your mind, where it's, I don't want to tell this individual no necessarily, but I also have the weight and responsibility of the safety and security of this flight? Like, what does your brain go through in that?
Sure. I always show up with an alternative. I've had those conversations many times, and I'm sure I'll have them many more times because of what we do. But what I'll do is I'll sit generally in the cockpits where most of the time it happens. Hey, the weather went down in Teterboro or whatever, and what are we going to do? So I'll sit there with the other crew member and say, hey, this looks bad. Let's talk this through. And I go back to the boss and tell her, hey, we can't get in here. However, we've already talked about this, and if we make the call now or whenever we need to with enough notice, we'll have the car standing by at this place. It's 20 minutes extra. If I were to try and go to our destination and it's probably going to be this long to hold, then there's going to be a line ahead of us. So we're talking grand total is going to be 90 minutes where I can take you down the road to a different airport, be 20 minutes, whatever the example is. So I show up with one or two options already in my hand because that shows that I've kind of thought out of the box to the boss. It also shows that I'm not saying no, but I'm also saying, hey, this isn't a great idea. However, here's the cost of it to do something else that's going to get you really close. And every time that I've had those conversations over multiple bosses and owners and all over the world, they've all said, do this or do that, make it happen. And it's never been an issue. If you're showing to take your private pilot check ride, like you were saying, and the weather's crummy, and then an hour later it turns blue, that happens to us too. I've diverted many times and went to other places and go, well, shoot, that didn't work out. It's not the end of the world. But if you show up on your truck ride day and the weather's crummy and you have the examiner standing there, the amount of maturity, the amount of wisdom that is going to be shown through, but you going, today, this is kind of on the edge, or this isn't going to work, but I already checked the forecast, and if it works for you on next Thursday, forecast next Thursday is great. That's going to show an awful lot of maturity and good decision making. I would be hard pressed to say you'd find an examiner that goes, yeah, that's not going to happen, because they're going to be pretty impressed.
Wise
do you agree
words.
with that?
I do, and I have similar techniques. I think it's even more important for somebody who is maybe flying themselves, and the boss is them. Right? Because sometimes you can put almost more pressure on yourself to finish a mission, even when it's just, I wanted to go out and fly, or I wanted to take a family member out because I've been talking about how I got my certificate a month ago and they've been asking about it. And, you're trying to shoehorn yourself into it, and maybe the conditions aren't right. Maybe the airplane's not ready, or you're not current, or any number of other things. And so what I'm hearing you say from any level, I think a lot of it starts out with sort of that communication. You don't have to do it alone. If you're in a crew, that's easy because you just go to your crew. But if you're a private or an instrument pilot, there's always your former flight instructor. There's always somebody at the FBO that, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. You and I don't know each other, but would you do it?
Yeah.
I don't know a single pilot that, outside of being on their way to getting out the door or something, like being late, that wouldn't stop and have that discussion with somebody in need. And so I think that's very important.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's a list of about 4 or 5 people in my phone that whenever I start to get a little twitchy about something, I call one of them at least. And I was like, here's what I'm doing. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll listen to it and they go, yeah, you're good. Or that's really dumb. Oh, right. I didn't think about that. The most concerning to me is the single pilot, because you are your own echo chamber if you allow it.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, hey, I want to go do this. I want to take this friend for a flight or whatever. I would reframe the question. Is it a want or is it a have to? Do I have to take this person for a ride today? Or do I want to take this person for a ride today? Those aren't the same questions in my mind. Mm-hmm. That's how I look at it.
Your student pilot in the room has been taking a lot of notes on this section, particularly as I'm flying, I'm making more PIC decisions. And we had a maintenance issue in the plane the other day. And the maintenance guy said, it's good to fly, but your PIC, you have to decide if you're comfortable. There was a little something hanging down in the engine compartment. I was like, ooh, this is what they were talking about, where it's up to you. But I am trying to actively cultivate that list of resources of people that I can call, particularly once I do get John has already been the recipient of night prior to flights texting and going, am I crazy? Should I do this? Should I not do this? What should I do? I think it's really important for single GA pilots to, like you said, not be in your own echo chamber and to be actively checking in with other pilots and just make that part of your standard operating procedure, that any go, no-go decision is never on your own single point of failure, which is you and your own brain, but that you're bouncing it off of other people. I think that's tremendous advice that I will definitely be endeavoring to follow. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's something that's been going on in this industry forever. It's not something we necessarily talked about, but it's been going on since the first days of flight. Really, people are having conversations. You may not have been privy to it. It wasn't put on social media. It wasn't, wasn't in a group text thread. But all these conversations, this is hanger flying. So a lot of these conversations have been going on for a long, long time, especially in the early days when the people are trying to figure things out.
I will say, Geeta, to your point on the maintenance side, those are some of the hardest ones.
Oh my gosh.
I've been in those shoes where the maintenance person goes, well, it's up to you. And you're sitting there going, well, I don't really know exactly what it is that you're talking about or what work you did. What do you think? And they go, I'm not telling you what I think. You're the pilot. I fixed the airplane. What more do you want from me? And you're just like, I want an answer.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that is a tough boat to be in. I've been there. I've even had it. It's funny. I've been on the phone. I remember I was on the phone with a weather briefer one time back when you actually used to call briefers.
Oh, remember that? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny. It was actually during my charter days because we were trying to get, it wasn't that long ago. We were trying to get some weather information and I called as like a last resort because I was like, I don't even know if they still answer the phones anymore. And the briefer was surprised because I don't think he'd gotten a phone call in a while. And so he just wanted to talk. And so we had, I don't know, a 20-minute discussion. And I ended up with like, okay, so you just described all the weather stuff. Half of it I understand. What do you think? And again, comes back to, well, you're the one strapping yourself to this thing. What I think is irrelevant. What do you want to do? It's like, oh man. So that can definitely be the hardest decision in the world when you're sitting there, especially thinking you're talking to somebody and maybe there's that extra bit of expertise coming out and they're just going, well, good luck.
Yeah. This is where I get off. Yeah.
So
it is the weight of being PIC.
It is.
It really is. That's a very true statement. It's a very true statement.
So Dan, as we finalize things here, do you have any kind of final thoughts or anything else you want to share about the Security Council or NBAA as a whole?
Sure. I think it's a great organization and I think we do some really important work. What I would suggest is just log on, go to NBAA.org and start poking around, see what you can find. Look for our Security Council or look for the Safety Council or just kind of have a look around because I'd be willing to bet there's a lot more there than you realize. Even as someone who's on the council, I was just on the website this morning, look at a couple things and I was like, I didn't see that before, or I did, and I forgot it. But it's well worth your time to have a look around and just start asking questions. Somebody no matter where you are in your journey, is going to know someone. That's the nice thing about this industry is it is a small industry, and we all know each other. That's how you and I got introduced, John, right? You and I got introduced by Dan.
Mm-hmm.
And just start asking questions and asking people of, hey, do you know about this? Or who would I talk to about that? Because I can sit here and tell you who to contact, but it may not fit your situation exactly. But, there's a lot of free resources on NBAA that can really get you started on a good path. And then you can make the decision if it's right for you to become a member or become a member and join one of the councils. Because, again, we're always looking for diverse points of view and diverse skill sets and experiences.
Well, we very much appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today.
This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that our listeners are going to, really have a lot to think about in terms of, again, how this entire map of safety and security and everything kind of comes together across all levels. And sharing that knowledge, I think, is the first step in making sure that everybody plays their part.
That's great. I think it's, you hit the nail on the head right there with that.
Welcome back, everyone. John and I here, and I hope you found that discussion as rewarding and interesting as I did. As I said, it really sort of changed my mind on security, and it got me thinking about what are some of the most actionable takeaways that we can give you pilots. You can start really putting into your toolkit today. So let's run through a few of those right now, John. The big one for me was to really reframe my thinking of security as this separate entity, this thing that just happens, but actually treating it like it's an invisible support. And it's forced me to realize that instead of letting it just be an invisible support, to start noticing the places where that security is happening. And if there's things that I can do to help that, and even if by noticing it can strengthen it as well.
Other things that Daniel mentioned was just sort of the idea of protecting your digital flight deck. So making sure that you're staying up to date with things like GPS spoofing and jamming. And we think of that as an international thing. But over the last few years, the military has actually brought down the GPS network over on the East Coast.
Hmm.
And they always put out NOTAMs and updates saying, hey, there's going to be a GPS outage. But a lot of people don't really understand what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're relying on it and you fly into that area and all of a sudden you see your GPS just disappear, that can create a lot of confusion. And so making sure that you're up to date on all of that is incredibly important.
Absolutely. I like to think sometimes, I'm in the solo phase of my training right now. I don't ever really feel like I'm as solo as I think I am because there's this whole web of things that has to happen for me to fly solo. And the security is part of that underpinning the whole time. And part of that is another takeaway from Daniel, which is securing our aircraft when it's on the ground. So making sure that we feel comfortable with how it's even stored at the maintenance hangar, thinking who has access to my aircraft when I'm not around, and treating the hangar and shop security with the same seriousness as a pre-flight. So again, instead of taking it from this invisible thing that we take for granted and therefore we don't notice when that safety and security is slipping, actually taking a little time to notice it. And in doing so, it can enhance the overall safety of the system. Then overall, we fly better and smarter because we're feeling a little more settled and grounded and really plugged into the whole system.
Now, the one thing that isn't invisible, and we talked about this as well, is just the notion of the very visible security fences and gates and barbed wire and all of those things, and the dichotomy between trying to welcome new people in, but also kind of, squinting at them as they walk by. Like, are you supposed to be here? We want you here, but are you supposed to be? And sort of weighing what that looks like and what that means and how it feels to newcomers. And so making sure that we understand that being inviting is important, but sort of trusting in our procedures to make sure that the people that we do invite are there for the right reasons.
Yeah, I think of this, it's coming to this as a formerly fearful flyer, and then someone who came to general aviation to help me overcome that fear of flying. It's super intimidating when you drive up to an airport and there's nothing but fences. And I'm talking a general aviation airport, there's like little putt-putts leaving from there. And there's all this massive security. And so it does feel extremely unwelcoming. And it feels like the message that most fearful flyers tell me, my friends say, I don't belong here. You don't belong here. It's inherently unsafe to be here. So we know that we need those fences. We know that they're there for a good reason. And so I think maybe one of the counters is to think of ourselves as being an ambassador for aviation. For me, one of the greatest delights when I get to do that solo taxi past the airport diner on a Sunday is when little kids are hanging on that fence looking at me. And of course, I'm maintaining situational awareness, but I can wave to the kids and they can make that connection that there's a pilot there waving at them, and that fence for just that moment disappears. So I'm trying to think of myself, and I'm calling out to any general aviation pilots out there listening. Are there ways that you can safely invite people onto the ramp, even just to look at your aircraft, to touch the airplane? Do you have a few minutes to invite that little kid and their family just to check it out for a moment? Because that also is part of safety, is bringing the community into what we're doing as well, and not having the gate be a barrier for the people that we want to be there, but keeping the bad actors out. So I think just there might be little ways that even I'm going to change every time I walk through that gate.
So another thing we talked about was just the care of your mental fitness and fitness to fly. Mental health equals flight safety. If you're not fit mentally, you're not fully fit to fly. So learn about different programs that are out there, both in aviation and outside. Dan talked about a mental health first aid program that he took that was peer supported and was extremely helpful to him. I'm not sure exactly whether that's something that is accessible to everyone, but certainly it's worth a shot. And normalizing, just checking in with yourself. Am I okay? Do I need to talk to somebody? Do I need to just not fly today? What should I do? And some of that is just at the idea of not overexposing yourself to all the things in life, saying no when you need to. Not every opportunity, even if it's a good one, is something that you have to participate in. It can always be something that's held for later. And he talks about the idea of operating at like an 80 to 85% capacity, because that gives you the ability to then ramp up to 100 instead of ramping above 100 and burning yourself out. So I thought that was quite profound, and it's just words to live by.
Yeah, I loved that mental image he gave of that sort of circular graph where he's applying effort in different vectors. And you can, in my mind's eye, I can see, the family vector getting full, and then the, prepping for a test vector becoming full, and just deciding where you want to use your energy in a more strategic way, but always having a buffer around the outer edge of that. So you're not always pushing everything 100% to that red line, but there's always this little buffer of energy to the best that you can, but that you're keeping a little bit in reserve, I think is really wise. And I was really glad that with Captain with so much experience of doing a lot of these trips, there's a lot of wisdom there. And I would love for especially like the younger new pilots to really think about that. And that's one way that we can create a rhythm for our life, which is something that we do in the wellness communities I'm part of, create a rhythm for a life that is sustainable. So as he said, you can grow outwards and ever expanding instead of just being a specialist of one thing that then means that all the other aspects of your life dissolve. That to me is one of the key takeaways from this episode. And that kind of brings us to his last actionable takeaway, which is building a pilot support network. If you have heard that once, you have heard that 1,000 times on this show, that we need mentors, instructors, and peers across every level of aviation, whether you're flying GA like I am, or if you are a professional pilot. We need other people that we can count on. And that's absolutely vital to our security, our safety, and quite honestly, our sanity as well. So as we wrap up today's episode, I would love to encourage you, if you found any part of this useful at all, you can always drop us an email at calmcockpit@gmail.com. Give us your opinions, your reflections on how these issues are affecting you in your life, especially if there's anything we missed or you'd like to hear a bit more of in a future episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. We love every email that we get. So thank you for sending those continually. If you have a little bit of time too, a 5-star review would be fantastic. It helps other people to find the podcast, and it brings these conversations to light, which we really hope are going to help the whole aviation community to rise and thrive together. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, or just share this podcast with a pilot who you think has a passion for security and for high performance. Thank you all so much for listening today. We hope you got as much out of the interview as we did, and that it really challenges your thoughts around security, professionalism, and maybe some new standard operating procedures that you can implement in your own life to help you fly smarter
and stress less.
Airbus Air 1 departure is Airbus 321. Traffic holding crossing runway 33 left 3 lane.